Welcome back to This Week in Immigration, our in-depth look at what really mattered this week in immigration policy. I'm Jordan Lapierre. On the show this week, we're unpacking the Senate's DACA debate, what happened, what didn't happen, and where we go from here. You can subscribe to this podcast and all of BPC's podcasts on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also stream on our website at bipartisanpolicy.org. And while you're there, you can find more information about all the topics we discuss. Just go to bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. My guests today are Theresa Cardinal-Brown, BPC's Director of Immigration and Cross-Border Policy. Hi, Theresa.
Hi, Jordan.
And Laura Hall, a Senior Manager at BBC Action. Hi, Laura.
Hi.
Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
So we were promised a week of freewheeling debate on DACA in the Senate. Did we get it?
Sort of.
Can we say half?
Can we say half? It wasn't probably as freewheeling as maybe some people thought it was going to be, where there were lots of different proposals put on the floor and votes on a lot of different things. As a matter of fact, for the first few days, we didn't have any votes at all on the floor as people were waiting on various negotiated packages and compromise proposals to be introduced. At the end of the day, we had a vote on three proposals that were sort of package deals, and one amendment on sanctuary cities, and in the end, nothing passed.
Yeah, so we did get a debate. I would agree with Theresa. It wasn't quite as freewheeling. We did kind of get to hear both sides of the issues. I feel like we learned a little bit, but unfortunately, we didn't get any answers.
Yeah, and as you said, Theresa, only kind
probably.
of four plans, 4 plans ended up coming up for a vote. Was that a surprise to either of you?
I don't think necessarily. I think maybe I had anticipated a few more amendments that instead of, big packages, kind of smaller things that might seek to improve some of the packages.
Yeah.
I was expecting a lot of things were introduced. Certainly a lot of amendments kind of got thrown out there, but ultimately called up for a vote. We did just see 4.
Yeah.
So
I think part of the issue was in trying to be as Mitch McConnell promised that he would be neutral in this, so he brought up for the underlying bill a completely unrelated House bill that dealt with COBRA funding.
Right.
So there was no immigration in the base bill whatsoever. And so the very first question is, what amendment would become the base for the conversation around immigration? And since there was no sort of leading candidate to be that base bill, it was basically a competition among 3 different plans to become that base. And when none of them passed, there was no base immigration bill to continue to debate, so none of the other amendments that maybe got put on there came up for a
there was
vote.
nothing to amend.
There was nothing to amend.
Yeah.
So none of the other amendments came to fruition.
Right.
So let's look at those bases a little bit. A couple of them did get majority support, but couldn't quite reach that 60-vote threshold that Leader McConnell had set. Which were the plans that were closest to passing?
So the first vote up was on a bill that introduced by Senators McCain and Coons. It was basically a border security for DACA fix. It included money for border security, not the full amount the president asked for and not necessarily the wall, but a lot of border technologies and border studies, and would have provided a path to citizenship for a large group of DACA recipients and other DACA eligible people. That vote, I think, came to about 52 to 47. So it did get a majority, but it did not get to the 60-vote threshold that was set to pass. The second vote was on a proposal that came out of the so-called Common Sense Coalition that Senator Collins and others were working on. Maybe people heard it called the Talking Stick Group, because when they first met, they had a talking stick they passed around, so everyone had turns talking. That was a very large bipartisan group. And they had a proposal that addressed at least 3 of the 4 pillars that the president had proposed. It would have fully funded the border wall, the $25 billion. It would have protected with a permanent status the DACA recipients and DACA eligible population. It made some small changes to the family-based immigration categories, primarily dealing with the parents of Dreamers. And it also did some codification of enforcement priorities to prioritize removing those who have criminal records and those who have recently entered. That proposal ended up getting the majority of votes, but still not 60, because that ended up with 54. Mm-hmm. And then the last...
So one thing I wanted to note on that middle one is it was interesting that earlier in the... I think there was a great sense of optimism that might be... And then earlier in the day, President Trump did come out against that proposal. So I think for some folks that might have been sitting on the sidelines waiting for Trump to weigh in, felt maybe that kept them from supporting that bill. That was a key moment.
Yeah, and the other thing I wanted to ask about, in addition to the White House reaction to that proposal, was the DHS statement that came out that morning, which was sort of incredible.
Right.
And something you don't see very often.
So DHS came out with a statement that attacked that proposal very, very strongly. It said that it would open up the floodgates, that it would basically prohibit any sort of immigration enforcement for a very long period of time. Mm-hmm. It was very strident in how it came out. Yeah. And as somebody who worked for DHS under the Bush administration and the Obama administration, I can say that I have never seen a statement from DHS about a piece of legislation like that.
Or from other agencies. I mean, I worked on the Hill quite a long time. I don't remember other agencies weighing in quite so strongly. So DHS or others. This was a pretty unique
and to weigh in publicly.
Statement.
I mean, we all...
Certainly behind
agencies have legislative affairs
sure.
shops who
that
hash
happens,
these things
but
out.
Yeah.
A public statement so kind of politically motivated, that was pretty unusual.
That was pretty unusual, and it did have a lot of ramifications. We know that they were up there heavily pushing Republican offices not to get on board the bipartisan proposal, and I think that did cause some of the response. The other reason I think some Republicans maybe did not support that bipartisan proposal is that the last bill up was this more comprehensive package from Senator Grassley and Senator Cornyn, which closely did align with the president's priorities. His framework of 4 pillars had some other things on it, including some other enforcement measures. Would have more restrictive, more radically restricted family-based immigration. Would have ended the diversity lottery program. Did have the $25 billion for the wall, but did also provide permanent status to DACA and DACA eligible population. The president had come out earlier and said that that was the proposal that he preferred, that they supported, and the White House was heavily lobbying on that. So probably a lot of Republicans were maybe reluctant to vote for the bipartisan proposal, even before the DHS statement where the president came out of it, because they wanted the chance to vote on the Grassley proposal.
And yet there were, I believe, 60 votes against that proposal.
Against. Yeah, that
some... I think many Republicans as well. I think that number was a little bit surprising. The thing that I think was interesting, almost everyone was on the record for voting for a fix for the 1.8 million Dreamers.
A permanent status, not just a temporary status, but path to citizenship.
So that Dreamer pocket, and then also some kind of border security
that's interesting.
component.
So if you look at the yes votes on each of the 3 plans,
everyone got it somewhere, basically. It's those other 2 pillars of the White House proposal that I think is where the debate's going to be. The so-called chain migration and the diversity changes to the legal immigration system seem like that's kind of what people can't quite come to agreement on.
Yeah, if you look at how those votes broke down, it was also very interesting. So on the Common Sense Coalition proposal, the bipartisan proposal, you had a lot of Democrats. You had a fair amount of Republicans, but you lost some Republicans and you lost a few Democrats on there because honestly, there were some advocacy groups that were divided about that proposal. They were not sure they could favor even the small changes to family migration or support the $25 billion for the border wall, or even the people reading those enforcement priorities as somehow enabling the Trump administration to do more enforcement. So there was division among immigrant advocacy groups on that proposal that sort of maybe hurt some of the Democratic vote. And then you look over at the Grassley vote, and you had a larger number of Republicans, not all of them. You lost some Republicans. You gained a few Democrats, 3, I think.
3.
But you lost the majority of Democrats on that proposal. So if you just look at how the votes stacked out and where the shifts lie, from a if you're trying to figure out where's the package that gets you majority, I've got to think it's got to be somewhere between those two proposals, because if you were able to kind of coalesce something and maybe pull from parts, there was an opportunity to amend either of those, we might have gotten to a place where we could have gotten to 60.
Right, but just the way the debate was structured and the way it was set up with kind of having a blank slate instead of something to react to and amend, you had to get to 60 before you could even amend something, which is a struggle.
Well, and you hinted at this a little bit, Theresa, but how much do you think the order in which these were considered impacted the result on the votes?
I think it was a big deal. Originally, the Grassley bill was scheduled to be one of the first votes up, and it would have come earlier in the debate, and Leader McConnell reordered it at the end of the day when he filed cloture on them and made that the last vote. I think there was some sense that by making it the last option, more people would be willing to get on. If nothing else passed, then you've got to get on this, because without it,
it's your last chance.
But it wasn't a strong enough bill. There were enough Republicans and enough Democrats that had concerns with the substance of that they couldn't support it, and it ended up getting the lowest number of yes votes of any of the proposals. So maybe they're rethinking whether that was the right strategy for them.
Hindsight's 20/20, but I think if maybe it had been a more traditional process that, hey, we put X on the floor and here's your chance to tweak it, change it, improve it, amend it, maybe that would have gotten a different result. I think he wanted kind of an open, everyone bring what they want to the table.
Does this make you feel that the window of what can pass the Senate, pass the House, and win the president's approval is bigger or smaller than we thought it was after seeing how these sort of, I guess we can call them test votes, how they came down last week?
I mean, as I said earlier, I think that if you're looking to find that package that can get 60 votes, a good, strong, bipartisan 60 vote in the Senate, it's going to be somewhat smaller package than what the president had proposed. It may include more enforcement. It may not include some of the more controversial pieces that he had introduced on diversity or family. I don't know exactly how that would play out, but probably we've always said we thought narrower could be better. When he added those pieces and insisted on them, that sort of created more space, if you will, between a lot of Republicans and Democrats on what a solution could look like.
Right.
The House is a different animal, though, and I would say that we've always had an issue of what passes the Senate may not fly in the House, and that's where ultimately the president has to be willing to say, this is the package that I will sign, please get it across the line to Speaker Ryan.
Yep, I think so too. When you add more things, there are more chances for people to oppose or cause problems or so I like these two things, but then when you add it in that third, I'm not quite there yet. So narrow, as BPC's been saying for a long time, that's still the way to go, I think.
So that having been said, do either of you expect the House to take action at this point, or if not, who makes the next move?
Well, the House had been trying to see whether there were enough votes to bring a bill that House Judiciary Chairman Bob Goodlatte had put together to the floor. That bill would have been a temporary fix for DACA recipients, significant changes to legal immigration, as well as a lot of other enforcement provisions such as sanctuary cities and Kate's Law and additional interior enforcement measures that haven't been part of the Senate conversation. But so far, it doesn't appear that bill has a majority of support to come to the floor. So the Speaker hasn't brought it to the floor. So there's not another vehicle, I'd say, in the House that is ready.
Right.
Yeah, it's not ripe to come to the floor in the House. So I'm not sure there's anything to be voted on there. And frankly, Congress is out this week, so nothing's happening this week. When they come back, then they have to figure out final appropriations for FY 2018 before the government runs out of money on March 22nd. So that's probably the next legislative opportunity.
Mm-hmm. And I think, too, and we might be getting to this later, but the courts are a factor in this as well. Yep. I think some members of Congress, the Senate had their say, their debate. I can see some folks now saying, like, hey, this is going through the courts. Let's let this play out and wait to act.
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point. There had always been this March 5th date floating out there that was sort of a deadline, but not really a deadline, and maybe that date means even less now that we've got 2 court cases pending. I think I ask you this almost every time we talk. Is there any chance something gets done before March 5th at this point?
I think it's highly unlikely.
No.
I think
Yeah.
it's highly unlikely.
I don't think so. No.
Yeah, I think it's highly unlikely.
And at this point, given the 2 court cases, does that even matter? Is March 5th still a relevant date in this conversation?
It does matter for the DACA recipients, and here's why. Even though 2 courts have ordered the administration to continue processing renewal applications, many of those whose DACA was due to expire after March 6th were not able to file until those court cases came out within the last month. So, and usually it takes DHS several months to adjudicate a renewal application. So a lot of them may be in a position where their current status expires, their work authorization, their protection, deportation expires. They filed an application to extend it, and it hasn't been adjudicated yet by DHS, so they have a gap. And that gap could be anywhere from a month to 4 months to 6 months. We just don't know how long it's going to take DHS to adjudicate these. And that leaves them vulnerable to deportation. It means that in the interim, they might lose their jobs or might lose their driver's licenses, depending on the states they're in. A lot of things can happen in that time. So for the DACA recipients themselves, yes, March 5th still matters. For those who may have a little bit of time before their DACA expires and they have a chance to file the renewals, it's not as imperative for them. But the administration has asked the Supreme Court to render a decision on this case quickly. And so we're expecting any day now, possibly as early as this coming Friday, maybe next week, for the Supreme Court to say whether or not they will take the case. If they decide to take the case, they can do one of 2 things. They can leave the injunctions in place and schedule a hearing for them to hear it, and then probably decide the earliest they would make a decision would be in June. They could lift the injunctions, which means that all those renewal applications go away, and schedule a hearing, or they could send it all back to the lower courts doing nothing. The injunctions remain in place, the lower courts will hear it, and then we may have a decision in a year and a half. That last factor would probably remove much of the legislative impetus to act, because if the injunctions remain in place, the administration has to continue to file renewal applications, and a final decision on the court cases sometime after the next year, then I think that takes a lot of pressure off Congress. So we do have to see how the courts...
But then conversely, at the end of that process, you could end up with an even more abrupt end to this process if that's the way things
absolutely
shook out.
could.
So an uncertain situation for DACA recipients is yet maybe even a little more uncertain right now.
Yeah, we continue to remain in limbo. And for all of the posturing and rhetoric around this issue and the political conversations, it's important to remember that these are people whose lives are in limbo. And they are in limbo until our leaders can figure out how to solve it.
I think that's as good a place as any to leave it for this week. Thanks to both of you for a good conversation. That's our show. Thank you so much for listening. Please take a second to find us on Facebook by searching Bipartisan Policy Center, or on Twitter at BPC_bipartisan. And don't forget to subscribe to this podcast as well as all of our podcasts on iTunes by searching Bipartisan Policy Center. Join us again next time.